Welcome back, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about the Persian Wars. A pretty important little episode in Greek history, really in the history of the world. And what I want you to do is I'd like you to focus on this question. Why were the Greeks able to defeat the Persians? So we'll see in many ways it was very improbable that they would, but what advantages did they have? Okay, and so again, that's just a focus question, something to guide your thoughts as we look through this section. The first thing I want to do is kind of a bit of review on what we've been talking about and really look at the economic, social, and political structure of Greece again. So first thing that I want to mention is that Greece was primarily a nation of small farmers and some big farmers. Okay, and this is going to be true throughout the ancient world. In the case of Greece, the staple crops were cereals, and by cereals, I'm not talking about Captain Crunch, I'm talking about grains, wheat, barley, that sort of thing. Olive oil was another staple of Greece. We talked about wine, probably supplemented with some fish and maybe some meat as well. The Greeks did practice some small-scale industry, which we've talked about: pottery, leather, iron. The list goes on and on. I should mention, though, and something we'll look at in our next slide, that most Greeks didn't regard doing craftsmanship or industry as a very noble career, and they would much prefer to be farmers rather than craftsmen. The Greeks, like many ancient people, had this real strange attachment to the soil. That was considered noble, but to work, as a craftsman of some sort was not. I should also mention, since we're talking about economics, that trade was just critical. Many of the bigger cities couldn't actually feed themselves from their surrounding countryside, and so they needed to trade, and sometimes trade from far away to get the grain that they would need. Also, luxury goods were another thing that the wealthy would want to procure from somewhere else, and so trade was really important. Okay. Now, I want to look at the social system, and I've added to it a little bit because, especially as we get into this classical age that we're talking about, the social system got a little more complicated. So at the top are elites. These are typically people who own big tracts of land. They're wealthy, they're powerful, no questions asked. Below them are middle-class farmers. These are people who have enough land to feed their families, probably have a slave or two. They're wealthy enough to be able to afford armor, and this is critical. To be a hoplite, to be a soldier, you needed armor, and back in those days, that wasn't provided for you. And so these two top classes would have fought as the soldiers of ancient Greece. Now, below them is a pretty big class of people, and these were landless citizens, or citizens with very little land. And these would have been very poor people, and these would have been people who probably could not afford their own armor. And so they wouldn't really be of very much use on the battlefield. All right. As we're going to see later, some of the more progressive, some of the more democratic states find a good use for these people, though, when it comes to warfare. Now, I hesitated on whether to put medics, this next group of people, above landless citizens, because economically they were usually better off. Medics were resident aliens. They were people who lived usually in bigger cities like Athens, and they usually did the trades and the crafts that I mentioned. I mentioned Greeks wouldn't want to do this necessarily. It wasn't considered very noble to do this. And so usually it was outsiders, foreigners who did this, other Greeks usually. And so they were usually fairly well off, but they didn't have citizenship and they did kind of ignoble work. And so I put them below landless citizens. And of course, lastly, there were slaves. Not the position you want to be in, although I should mention some slaves could have pretty good jobs, but still not something you wanted to be in if you were an ancient Greek. Now, politically, I mentioned last time that Greek city-states generally fell into two different categories. One were oligarchies. An oligarchy means rule by the few. Oligos means few. Archy comes the Greek word for power. And states like Sparta were considered oligarchies. They had a narrow voting rights. The other major category were democracies, and this comes from the Greek word for people, and same word, kratos, power to the people. But we always need to keep in mind when we're talking about ancient democracies that by the people we mean male, we mean free, we mean citizen, so medics would have been excluded, and usually some age of majority, 18 or 21 or something like that. Now, I should also mention that these categories could change a bit. Sometimes, depending on circumstances, a state might be a democracy at one point in history and then go to an oligarchy and then back. And so, you could pass back and forth between these. Okay. Now, so one of the things that we need to remember is there was no Greece at this point. Greece was rather a collection of individual city-states, of polises, or polis is the plural. Group of polises are called a polis is the way to actually pronounce it. Now, the majority of these were in Greece, as you can see this big cluster on the map here. But Greek polises, or polis, could be found all throughout the Mediterranean world, and as I said, each was independent. And so war was pretty common among them. So they would battle each other occasionally for land or for trade routes or whatever the case may be. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that the average Greek citizen was a farmer first and a soldier second. Greece didn't have a professional army at this time. Greece's state, the polis, were rather primitive in terms of taxation. They didn't have a big tax budget, and so citizens were soldiers were citizen soldiers. That is, they didn't get paid for it, and they were farmers for most of the years. And so this wasn't usually a problem, though, because wars among the hoplites, among the phalanxes, tended to be pretty quick affairs. Usually the phalanxes would line up against each other, they would crash into each other violently, and within a few hours the war was over, and the survivors could go back to their farms without very much trouble. Now, I should also mention that sometimes the Greeks would form into leagues. This would be a group of polis would get together and they would join together for mutual protection or to go on a campaign of some sort. Now, this was often voluntary. You would see the advantage in cooperating with your neighbors, perhaps. But sometimes there was pressure to join a league, and this was going to become more common later. Now, a good example of this is what is called the Peloponnesian League. This is an example of one, and Peloponnese is down here, and you can see it in this kind of peach color here. And this was a group of city-states in the Peloponnese that agreed to cooperate together. And normally a league would have a leader, and the name for the leader is the hegemon. And when you exercise this leadership, it's called hegemony. And this is a word you should get to know. It's a word used sometimes even to this day. Okay, and so that was really the extent of cooperation among city-states, just offensive and defensive leagues. What I want to do now is I want to turn to Persia, because Persia is going to be an important player in 5th century Greece. And a little bit about the Persian Empire. We've talked about the Persian Empire in class. And the Persian Empire was absolutely huge. Just to give you a little bit of perspective on the Persian Empire, this right here is Greece, and this giant monstrosity here is the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire was the dominant power in Southwest Asia in the 5th century. Its empire had been won under its enlightened and tolerant ruler, Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus gets a lot of plaudits in the ancient world for being a very tolerant and enlightened ruler. Didn't impose himself like previous emperors had done. Now, it's important to talk a little bit about the Persian army, because the Persians fought quite a bit differently than the Greeks. Being a large empire, the Persians focused on speed, and so they tended to be much more lightly armed than the Greeks did. They were excellent on horseback. They were great bowmen. They could fire arrows very accurately even while riding on horseback. The Persian infantry tended to be lightly armed with quilt-like armor and wicker shields. The Persians tended to make much greater use of arrows, and so they're pretty lightly armed. The Persian king had a group of elite bodyguards called the Immortals, I had the Untouchables in my notes, and I realized that was a mafia movie. The Immortals were the elite bodyguard corps, so called because when one died, not that they didn't die, but when one died, they would replace that individual. So it was always a set amount. In addition to its regular army, Persia also had access to a vast array of various peoples it had conquered. Part of the deal of being in the Persian Empire was that you had to provide troops when the Persian king called upon you. And so, in theory, the Persians could field something like a 2 million man army if they really wanted to, although they almost never did. Now, the Persians began to expand into Asia Minor, which was right next door to Greece, under Cyrus. In 546, Cyrus went to war against a king of the Lydians. The Lydians were a kingdom that dominated Asia Minor in the mid-6th century, and their king's name was Croesus. And there's kind of an amusing story about this that I'll share with you. Croesus wanted to know whether he should attack the Persians. And so he went to go see a prophetess called the Oracle at Delphi. An oracle is like a prophet. And the oracle was a young virgin female priestess. He asked her, and she was supposedly able to communicate with Apollo. She would ingest these vapors that came up from the floor of a cave that she stood in, and she was able to communicate with Apollo. And he said, "Should I attack Cyrus, the king of the Persians?" And so she asked Apollo, and she got the prophecy that if he attacked the Persians, that a great empire would fall. And so for Croesus, this was all he needed to hear. He went out and he attacked Cyrus, and he was defeated. Now, of course, Apollo didn't lie. The great empire that was going to fall was his own. And so that's one of the tricky parts about dealing with oracles, is they're always kind of like magic 8 balls. You can never really be 100% sure what they mean. Well, anyways, with the defeat of Croesus, Cyrus and the Persians now dominated all of Asia Minor, including the Ionian Greeks. And so this is the first time the Greeks would come into contact with the Persians. Now, from 546 all the way till 499, things were rather amicable. And the Persians, in fact, even pushed further, and they managed to actually get into Europe itself, into the far northeast corner of Europe. All right. And so you can see here on this map these little areas with the red are places that are Greek city-states. Okay. Well, eventually things soured between the Greeks and the Persians, though. In the year 499, a revolt broke out among the Greek city-states of Ionia. And again, Ionia is this area right here on the west coast of Asia Minor. These Greeks wanted freedom. They resented the taxation, a variety of grievances. But the point is they revolted in 499. And so they appealed to the mainland Greeks. Once they had revolted against the Persians, expecting retaliation, they appealed to the mainland Greeks. And they got basically a no from all of them, except for Athens. Athens was the only major Greek city-state to give them any sort of aid, and they sent over 20 ships. But even with this aid, within a few short years in 494 BC, the war was over and the Persians had reasserted their domination. But the Persian king Darius, Cyrus was gone, Darius was now king, resolved to punish the Greeks for their transgression, particularly the Athenians. The Athenians had sent over these ships, ergo they must be punished. And plus, to be fair, the king of Persia probably wanted to conquer Greece anyways, and just used this as a pretext. And so the Persians determined there was no need to call up the entire Persian army for this. This was going to be a relatively easy operation, they believed, and so they sent over 30,000 ships. And they landed right next to Athens, about 26 miles away, in a little town in Attica called Marathon. Now, the Athenians knew they were coming, and so they pretty much did the same thing the Ionians had done. Would anyone care to help us? And they sent out word to the Spartans. Surely the Spartans will come. But the Spartans said, well, we'd like to help, but we're in the middle of a festival, and it would be sacrilege if we broke it. If you guys are still alive when we're done, we'll come and save you. Well, this wasn't really a good answer because the Persians were now here, and all the Athenians could muster were 10,000 soldiers. Not a good ratio, right? 30,000 to 10,000. And so the Athenian strategy was make sure the Persians don't spread out from the beach. So they watched them land and pinned them down on the beach. And the two groups faced off about a mile from each other, as you can see here. And this persisted for about 5 days, neither side wanting to make the first move. Finally, on the fifth day, as the Persians were out feeding their horses, the Persian Calvary, the Athenians struck. They rushed the Persians where they were, on the beach. The Persians were ready, though. They cocked back their bows and unleashed a torrent on the approaching hoplites. And to the dismay of the Persians, the arrows bounced off the hoplites. Why? Well, hopefully you remember from last time, the hoplites are really heavily armed, and they're pretty much impervious to arrows. And so then the Greeks got into their formation, their phalanx formation, as they approached, and doing what they had trained so long to do, they began to push. Now remember, that's how the phalanx fights, as it pushes, and this is pretty much what they do. The lightly armed Persians ultimately were no match for the Greeks, who managed to basically push them into the into the water, or to slash them dead on the beach. What was left of the Persian army picked up, ran, swam to their boats, and got the hell out of Greece. At the end of the day, as numbers were being tallied, 192 Athenians were found to have lost their life to 6,000 Persians. So a pretty big rout. There's another interesting story from this. As the Greeks were sitting there high-fiving each other on the beach, they realized that the people back in Athens, some 26 miles away, probably were probably wetting themselves in fear, thinking that they had lost. And so they sent their fastest man, a man by the name of Phidippides. And Phidippides ran the whole 26 miles to tell the Athenians the good news. As he ran, he reportedly was yelling, "Nike, Nike," which means victory in Greek. Ran the whole way, had one last Nike left in. He told the gathered crowds at back at Athens the good news, and then he dropped dead. And so everybody was stoked by this good news, except Phidippides' mom probably, but it was a great victory for Athens. By the way, the Spartans came a few days later and said, lucky we weren't here. We would have imagined what we would have done to them. But nonetheless, a great victory. Unfortunately, though, for the Greeks, it would be a short-lived celebration, because within a decade or so, the Persians were going to be back. This time it would be under a different king, a king by the name of Xerxes. Darius died, and his son Xerxes succeeded him a few years later. And Xerxes determined that he was going to invade Greece and punish them once and for all. This time he wasn't going to send an expeditionary force, though. This time he was going to bring the house. So he sent out ambassadors to all the Greek polis, demanding earth and water as a sign of submission. Of course, you guys probably know the story about what happened when they went to Athens and Sparta. The ambassadors were thrown down the well as a no thank you. But this was such a large army. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, 2 million Persians came. It's probably an exaggeration, but there were a lot of them. It was so big that you can see this area here. This area is called the Hellespont up here. And this is the area that separates Europe from Asia. It's a narrow waterway. The Persians actually built a bridge, a temporary bridge, across this waterway. At its narrowest, it's still 3/4 of a mile wide. So they set up a bunch of boats together, put some planks on top, and managed to march their whole army across. And so the Greeks formed themselves, recognizing that the Persians were coming. The Greeks began to form themselves into a league, and this league was called the Hellenic League. I think it should be, you should be able to see this here, Hellenic League. I just want to pause briefly and talk about this word Hellene. The Greeks actually called themselves not Greeks, that's what the Romans called them. The Greeks called themselves Hellenes, and so the Hellenic League was an all-Greek league, or mostly all Greeks, not all Greeks joined. And this league was going to be led by Sparta. And of course, there's the famous story of how the Spartans went up to Thermopylae, immortalized in the movie 300. Thermopylae is up over here, to try to stall the Spartans. They chose this area apparently because it was very narrow, and 300 would be able to block up the pass and be able to fight a little more fairly against the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Persians, because they'd all have to funnel. And so it's a really famous story about how the Spartans stood for 3 days and fought, and then died almost to the man. But the Persians were able to dislodge the 300 Spartans, and they were able to eventually march on Athens, which was the next stop on the train. As a matter of fact, the Athenians ultimately ended up abandoning the city and opting for a naval battle instead. Now, I should mention that, again, the Greeks weren't a country, so it wasn't like the Greeks had any kind of a foreign policy. One of the few preparations that any Greek city-state had actually made was Athens. Athens had built a big fleet of triremes. And I think you can see the word written up there on the screen. A trireme is a type of warship. It's an improvement on the galley. It has 3 decks of rowers, so they're really fast, they're very powerful, and they were a new naval weapon at the time. And Athens had invested pretty heavily in this, and it turned out to be a good idea, because the Athenians managed to trick the Persians into fighting them on the open sea, rather than strictly having an infantry battle. And this proved to be a very, very clever move on the part of the Athenians. The battle was called the Battle of Salamis. It took place off of the coast of Athens. The King Xerxes himself was there, looking on he was up on a high mountaintop watching the battle unfold, and the well-disciplined and really at home on the water Athenians were able to defeat once again his much larger force and basically sink his entire navy to the bottom of the ocean. A huge victory for the Greeks, and especially for Athens. Well, the Battle of Salamis was really the turning point in the war. As a matter of fact, Xerxes himself was completely disgusted by the outcome and didn't even really want to stick around anymore. He left the last of his army there, but the following spring, at the Battle of Plataea, the Greeks were able to defeat this Persian force, and they ended the Persian threat once and for all. And this really ushered in a golden age for Greece. This was a massive win, a real David versus Goliath situation. The war unleashed a massive amount of pride on the part of the Greeks, pride in the freedom, pride in Greece itself. Many plays and art sculptures were written to portray this. And another thing I should mention, because it'll come into to effect later, is it also developed something called xenophobia. And I think we all know what a phobia is, but the word xenos means foreigner, and so xenophobia is a fear or dislike of foreigners. And so one of the characteristics of Greek culture is the belief that the Greeks, are superior, and other people, especially non-Greeks, are inferior. As a matter of fact, the Greek word for a non-Greek was a barbarian. It didn't matter how cultured this individual was. If you were a non-Greek, you were regarded as a barbarian. And the way they arrived at this word is somewhat humorous. To the Greek ear, when foreigners spoke, they sounded like sheep, going bar, 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 bar. And so they called these individuals who were non-Greek barbarians. Okay. All right, well, that finishes up our discussion on the Greeks. I went a little longer than I wanted to. And again, this is our focus question. Why were the Greeks able to defeat the Persians? What advantages did they have? All right, so if you liked the video, please press like. I've always wanted to say that. And you can subscribe to my channel for your convenience. I'll see you next for 5th century Athens.